Hi, everyone. Pam Martin here, one of the co-leaders of the virtual chapter. And welcome to our presentation. We're really excited to have Clay with us today. It's always a good time when we have Clay.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start out with, I've got to share, just bear with me because I'm in Ohio and everything's taking longer. Okay, here we go. Can everybody see that on their screen? Give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so it's hard time right now. It seems like every day we are getting bombarded with bad news. And I thought this was a good poster because it talks about how you resist. And if you can't be protesting in the streets, if you can't be out writing letters to the editor. You can make phone calls. You can send in postcards. There are several organizations that'll do that. You can stay informed. You can talk to friends and family and talk to them about what's bothering you. There's all these things that you can do, and I would imagine that you're all doing one of them. And the key is not to feel guilty if you can't do like protest in the streets. Use your own form of resistance and make sure that you take time to take a breath because, I get pretty excited when these things start happening. So this is just a way to remind you that it's okay, take time for yourself and then get right back out there and resist in the ways that you are doing it. Okay, so I'm going to unshare that. There. Okay, are we all back? Yes, I think so. Okay, announcements. We are working on a program on Kansas water issues, and we'll see when we can get that going, hopefully for October. So be looking for that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Susan, and she'll introduce herself and give us some information.
Okay. That was Pam Martin.
Oh, did I not say Pam?
Pam Martin is our leader for our virtual chapter. She's also the leader of the Great Bend Barton County chapter. I'm Susan Osborne, and I'm a member of the executive committee, and I'm normally in Wichita, although I'm in Eureka Springs, Arkansas right now. Just want to let you know that Women for Kansas is coming up on our 10th anniversary. Our first meeting was in 2016. We are nonpartisan, statewide, organized group with chapters throughout the state. We're interested in uniting and activating moderate, independent women and men in order to elect moderates to office. What a novel idea. And we believe in equal rights for all, separation of church and state, healthcare as a human right, excellence in our public schools and our higher education. And that's just some of the things that we feel strongly about. You're welcome to go to womenforkansas.org and learn more about us. Decide if you want to be a paying member or if you would like to donate. And if you have a question at some point, Clay is going to indicate he's ready for questions. I would suggest putting your hand up or putting it in chat. And either way, and if you put it in chat, I'll make sure that the question is asked. If you want to ask your own question, put a hand up. Does that sound good, Pam? Okay. Yes. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful day.
Yeah, taking time away from it. Okay, well, let's introduce Clay. As most of you know, he's the opinion editor for the Kansas Reflector, and we love the Kansas Reflector. Yay. His work has appeared in more than 200 outlets in 30 states. This is a busy guy here. He's written columns, edited copy for newsrooms in Kansas, New Hampshire, Florida, and Pennsylvania. He's also fact-checked politicians. That's always fun. Researched for label Larry the Cable Guy, and appeared in PolitiFact, Mental Floss, and CNN. He's currently finishing a book for the University Press of Kansas about opinion writing. And beyond the written word, he has drawn cartoons, hosted podcasts, designed graphics, and moderated debates. Clay graduated from the University of Kansas and lives in Lawrence with his husband and son. And without further ado, thank you, Clay.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Give a thumbs up. Yes. Um, so I'm actually delighted to say I sent that book manuscript off to my editor this morning. So that's exciting. Yes. Um, so I was actually really excited when asked to talk a little bit about, kind of words and language and rhetoric, especially as we're kind of coming into this second Trump administration. Because I think, there are obvious and kind of not obvious levels on which language works on us, works on people. I've spent 20 years or so in journalism. So, I think about words a lot. I look at words a lot. And, it's not necessarily the way that everybody else kind of thinks about and looks at words. I also, spent 4 years outside of journalism working in nonprofit communications. And when you do that, you kind of get your hands dirty with some of the kind of the actually using words for kind of those political or really super persuasive purposes. Um, I think it's important just really right at the beginning to talk about just a word itself, like a unit of language, because I think sometimes um, it can be easy if you just go along in life not to think so much about like what a word means. And I think a lot of times when we talk about words, we think about like big words like antediluvian or centennial or whatever it is. Onomatopoeia. We like the big words or words that are unusual, but every word kind of operates on a couple of levels, right? There's the basic sound, whatever it is, when you're saying it. There's basically what it means. And then there's kind of all, what it means, like literally. And then there's kind of all of the different layers of meaning, kind of association that attach themselves. And you know, you can think about this in the sense that there are sometimes words that people well, a good example is like the word moist, which apparently people really don't like the word moist just because of the way it sounds. Some people have a reaction to just the actual sound of the word. It doesn't have anything to do with what it means. It's just kind of the way it sounds. People think it's unpleasant. So whenever you are looking at words or rhetoric that come from a politician or that come from some sort of partisan actor, you really need to be aware that the words are not just a single unit of meaning, right? It's got these subterranean levels, it's got context, it's got a lot of stuff going on around it. And so I kind of have a couple of lists here. Um, and I think, it's really important to start talking about kind of the killer words, right? These are words that politicians or partisans will use to paint the other side of a debate as kind of unacceptable. And it's important to understand that these words, they're not just used by folks on the right to talk about people on the left. Sometimes they're used by people on the left to talk about people on the right. Um, a really good example is a word like radical or a word like extremist, right? Or perhaps a radical extremist. This is something that's used a lot to talk about someone who's on the left. Oh, they're a radical extremist. And the answer is, of course, those words mean certain things, but they have implications beyond that. They have implications of unacceptability, right? If you say that somebody's a radical or someone's an extremist, well, what that means is, it doesn't deal with the substance of their ideas or their viewpoints at all. It's simply saying that they are outside of the norm. And then it means that we don't have to think about them. One of the other things I think you've seen a lot more from Trump and folks associated with Trump are, words that kind of connote mental illness, crazy, lunatic, insane, stuff like that. And again, these are words that, have been used a lot. And, sometimes we use them just kind of when we're blowing off steam. It's like, oh, that person's crazy. But, using them over and over again towards another person, they're crazy, they're a lunatic, they're nuts. Again, it's a way of distancing, othering whatever that person is saying in a way that we don't have to think about it. Likewise, a great trick, and in Kansas, sometimes it's used by talking about like somebody's from Lawrence liberal, but nationally you have it as New York, San Francisco. The idea is that they're coming from a big city. They're not like us. Doesn't have anything to do with what they're saying. What doesn't have anything to do with what the content of their arguments. It's where they're from. Then you start getting into terms that like no one is going to say they're for. Something like big government, something like welfare, something like bureaucracy or bureaucrats. Again, no one wants to say we're in favor of big government. Even big business, to an extent, is like that. Or oligarchs is a new one that's used somewhat on the left for talking about big business interests. But the point is, these are terms that and especially something like welfare. Welfare has decades of associations, of negative associations with it. And what is welfare? Well, I mean, actually, it's usually some sort of payments that help people who need help, right? I mean, it's not actually a negative thing, but that word has cottoned on so many negative thoughts and negative connotations. You're never going to hear a left of center politician saying, I support welfare. They're never going to say it. They're going to say, I support, I'm in favor of family supports or helping people who need help or, something like that. So, when you hear language like this that includes like radical extremists in favor of big government and bureaucracy, again, no one wants to say they're in favor of bureaucracy, but I can also tell you, if you guys know anything about how any government works, about how any organization over a certain number of people works, you have to have bureaucracy. Like bureaucracy is actually how things run. You have to have people who know what the steps are and where the forms are and how to make something happen. It's actually a kind of a neutral thing. Again, it's become associated with these negative things. And the most important thing always is awareness of the words. So if you are hearing something that you're like, well, gosh, that sounds really bad. I can't possibly argue with that. It's because it's using such charged language that essentially you can't disagree with it. But those are the negative words. There's another version of this, which are the positive connotations. And these are things that you can always see on mailers and hear in ads when it's election time. My favorite is common sense. Common sense change, common sense laws. Who's against common sense? No one could possibly be against common sense. But again, everybody's definition of that changes. Another pro-family, pro-growth, fair share. Again, who's against the family? Who's against growth? Who's against a fair share? A classic one is, a hand up, not a handout. Tax cuts, low tax. Again, these are all things that nobody in their right mind would go in public and say, I'm not for this, right? So it allows you to really paint a shaded picture. A classic word that always makes me my antenna go up is reform. Somebody says we're reforming something. Reform, actually, the word itself has a connotation that it's positive, that you're changing something for better. But I'll tell you, a lot of times, if you're looking at something that people call reform, they're just changing it. They're changing it to be more beneficial to whatever their side is, but they'll call it reform. Um, Other words, responsible, right? Again, who doesn't want to be responsible? And then, things like, a balanced budget. Well, actually, legally, almost every state has to balance its budget. Like that is actually a requirement for states. So if somebody who's a state legislator tells you they voted for a balanced budget, well, yeah, everybody does. That's what you have to do on the state level. Um, Lately there's a lot of talk about Americans and citizens, right? And this is again, it's kind of a rhetorical trap because it's an in group and an out group. No one's going to say I'm against Americans. No one's going to say I'm against citizens. But by centering those things, saying, "Oh, this is great for," oh yeah, another great one, hardworking. Who's not hardworking? I support hardworking American citizens. Okay, yeah, sure. Um, but I think it's so this kind of rhetoric, and it's funny because I think for most people, if you follow politics at all, and I see some of the smiles and the reactions, like we know these things, like we hear these words, but because they're repeated so often, because they're in the air all the time, I think it can be easy to kind of forget what they are and what they do to us. And let me tell you, from my experience, again, working in the nonprofit sector, I can guarantee you that communications professionals and politicians and their staff, they think about these things all the time. They think about these words all the time. They probably have meetings when they talk about, call it this thing, don't call it this other thing. When I was in it, I mean, that when I was in the field, that was one of the things we had to do was talk about these various programs that at one point you would have called welfare. So things like, again, SNAP, which is what it used to be called food stamps. Again, food stamps got some negative connotations, and so now they call it SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. But things like that, things like TANF, which is temporary assistance for needy families, that used to also be welfare. And so you also, though, you tend to cause these problems, and this is a problem particularly on the left, where the words that people traditionally use to refer to these things to have gotten so many negative connotations that you try to use new words, right? And unfortunately, then, if you try to use new words, people don't necessarily know what you're talking about. So, this is part of the huge issue with talking about immigration in our country right now. For a long time, the term, which, is considered somewhat offensive now, is to say people were illegal aliens, right? And no one wants to say that now. We don't even want to say that someone's an illegal immigrant, again, because you can't be an illegal person. So we've moved now to things like someone who's undocumented, someone who's a migrant, whatever. But this then leads to the challenge of, for some folks, if they don't keep up on what the words are or don't think about it, they're like, well, why are you using these fancy words that I don't understand? And so I think sometimes there is the challenge that folks in the center and to the left of center have to deal with is maybe sometimes in terms of reaching people, it's better to use a slightly tinged language that people understand rather than trying to get them to use words that they're unfamiliar with and that maybe make them react negatively to you. I wrote a column on a week ago, or it was Monday of last week. It was kind of talking about this, and I mean, I don't know if I agree with this. There's a group called Third Way. It's kind of a moderate Democratic group, and they actually put out a memo of a bunch of terms that they said people on the left or Democrats running for office shouldn't use. And there are a lot of these kind of maybe more academic uh, phrases. And I don't know that I disagree with that, but I also think that you know, uh, I think sometimes it's more important to just be aware of what the language is doing to us rather than necessarily like saying, okay, I've got to pick one of like the 6 or 7 terms in my head. I think it's whatever, my personal preference is always that people try to make themselves understood as well as possible. So I talked about the negative side of words, or the ones where people it's really trying to exclude. I talked about kind of the common sense words, where the ones where it's very difficult to disagree with. The final thing I'd like to highlight, though, and I think this is one of the ones that I'd be really careful about, is when politicians omit things. These are the missing words. And so this is actually a really key thing. It's something that I really noticed when Senator Moran, who voted for the big beautiful bill, he put out a press release after it passed, and I wrote a column about this. But the press release that he put out is really interesting, because not because of what it says, but because of what it doesn't say. So, just kind of going through it, it's the headline on it is Sen Moran's statement on passage of the Senate budget reconciliation. Well, you notice he doesn't call it the big beautiful bill. He never uses that term. He calls it the Senate budget reconciliation. So I think that's a really interesting point. Like, why isn't he calling it the same thing that everyone else does? Um, he says, as this legislation was being drafted, I worked to make certain hospitals in Kansas were at the forefront of these discussions. I was able to make changes to make certain Kansas hospitals will not face any immediate cuts upon enactment of this legislation. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Immediate cuts. Well, it doesn't mean that they won't face cuts. It doesn't mean that, you know, they couldn't face considerable cuts, just nothing immediately. Then these provisions will protect Kansas's ability to continue pursuing its application for increased Medicaid payments for certain providers. It's a statement that doesn't say anything. Okay, it protects its ability to continue pursuing its application. It doesn't mean it gets the application. It doesn't mean the application will be granted. It merely means it can continue pursuing this. And for who? Not for everybody, for certain providers. Which providers? He doesn't say. This change ensures that as certain directed payments wind down, they'll be starting at a higher percentage, yada, yada, yada. I also secured a 1-year delay in the implementation of reductions to these state-directed payments. So it's like, well, why do we need a 1-year delay? What does that mean? What happens after the 1 year, right? Again, it doesn't say. And ultimately, while he then has a bulleted list of various changes that are in the bill, he never once uses the word Medicaid. Medicaid's not in the word Medicaid is not in the press release at all. And actually, we know that Medicaid is one of the things where we will have fewer Kansans receiving health coverage because of that. So I think it's really important, and this is especially something that you see with folks who are, ostensibly more moderate. When they tout the passage of something like this, what are they leaving out? What don't they have in there? And what does it mean that it's not included? And let me tell you, if you think this is a small thing or this is something that they don't notice, I can tell you absolutely that it's not, because we ran a column about Moran's vote. It was not one of my columns, it was from a contributor, and his lead communications person from Washington, D.C. was on the phone to me, to like my editor, sending multiple emails trying to get the piece changed, or trying to get things, because they are so sensitive about, well, basically telling the truth about what the senator did, that and again, I wrote about this in a piece. I said, they're really interested in working the refs. Meanwhile, The senator, as near as I can tell, has not actually appeared in any forum where he could answer questions from the press or the public about the vote and about what the vote means. And so, you know, I think, again, as I said, there are a lot of levels to talk about this because, there's the rhetoric that goes out, but then, there's the rhetoric that's not used, the things that are ignored. And on a certain level, I'm less bothered by the stuff that people say, because at least they say it. At least you have a record of it. At least you can take that word and define it and pick it apart and bring attention to it. It's when they don't say things or when they really omit things, like that's where you have to be super on top of stuff, super super careful to even notice that's not there. And I can guarantee you that a lot of them hope that people don't notice that. They really hope that people don't notice that. Now, there is a lot more that I could do, a lot more places I could go, but I'm going to open it up to conversation or questions or anything from the group.
Okay, I would encourage anyone at this time to do one of two things. Either put your question in chat or raise your hand in the, where do you do that?
Oh, down under
Under react.
react.
Under react.
Mhm.
And I want to start off with one if I could, Clay. Are you worried at all as a journalist? Someone who speaks freely. I know that Trump seems to be coming after like TV stations and CBS and what have you. Are you at all concerned?
I think anybody who's in the news media has a certain level of concern. That being said, um, one of the things that has always made broadcast media somewhat vulnerable is, broadcast media is one of the few kinds of speech that is actually regulated by the government in a way because it uses the public airwaves. That's something that, TV and radio have dealt with for a long time. And so, I think it's one of the reasons, right, that something like Fox News doesn't exist as a broadcast station. It exists as a cable station because it's not regulated by the FCC in the same way. I think, uh, I definitely think that there is, more care and more caution these days. But I also think that, at least for now, at least for now, the jurisprudence and everything I mean, the First Amendment is very heavily litigated. There's a lot of strength behind the precedents on that. Um, you know, some of the stuff that's happening in terms of some of these settlements that the president has reached with certain broadcasters doesn't have anything to do with the legal strength of the arguments and more just that they have, that the news media is like this much of the business of a corporation that's like this big. And so it's much cheaper for Disney or Paramount or whomever to pay a few $1 million and like not have to deal with something going on as a lawsuit for several years. I think in almost all of these cases, if the case had actually gone to court, there's no question that the news media outlet would have won. Yeah, but I could do another hour on this, but but I would say, there is certainly some caution, there is certainly some concern, but I think there's also there's this whole other aspect with the second Trump term where a lot of people are kind of freaking out in advance of things. And it's not that there shouldn't be freakouts when certain bad things happen. It's just that I think it does everyone. It's better to react to things when they actually happen rather than saying, "Oh my God, something terrible could happen in the future." It might, it could, but we're hanging on for now.
Okay. Thank you.
It looks like Jane has her hand up.
Mhm.
So my favorite words, I have two nominations, tax relief it stuns me when Democrats say tax relief because that's such a Republican soundbite. And my newest is Department of War. Would you comment on either one of them? Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, tax relief is one of those things. It's like reform. It's such a trap. I really believe very strongly, kind of all issues, and again, this had to do with my time in the nonprofit sphere. People really underrate like the value and the importance of taxes as something that is part of the way that like we have a government that works for us, right? We pay for it, it works for us. And this idea of taxes as being some sort of, some sort of terrible imposition on people is, I mean, it's problematic. I mean, the problem is again, taxes literally have centuries worth of hatred directed towards them. So kind of how you deal with that is a challenge. Um, in terms of the Department of War, I think it goes towards a lot of stuff with this administration, which is it's really dumb. Like it's just really dumb. And I and to me, I look at something like that, and it's like on one hand, you can talk about all of the negative aspects that come about from saying like like, oh, it's war, we're gonna show people who's boss and all of that, and just all the negative stuff there. But then I also feel like sometimes with something like that, it's kind of a provocation, right? It's daring people to get upset about the use of the word war. And like, I don't think it's a great idea. I think it's dumb, but I mean, is it something that I'm going to be, you know, I mean, I don't know. Like there's only so much outrage that anyone can carry with them every day. And so to me, I try to figure out how to portion my outrage to the things that I am most concerned about.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's one of them right now, but we'll see.
You'll see.
Um, okay, so actually Paula wrote something here in the chat. She
Mhm.
wrote, so what do you do when you email your senator, either Moran or Marshall, and ask what they mean about something left out of their political message, and all you get back is more bland pablum? A great use of pablum, by the way. The only one who knows they are not responding to a reasonable question is you and maybe your immediate circle. Well, I mean, I think the answer to that is sometimes all we kind of have are small actions and our immediate circles. I think it is, you know, I think this is something that as an opinion writer, I've kind of had to come to terms with as well, which is it's this is a nonprofit term. This is one of the things that Third Way doesn't want me to use in talking to people, but the concept is a theory of change. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about this, but it's actually a really useful phrase. So basically, anytime you're talking to politicians or you're talking to nonprofit groups, there's a question about the theory of change, and basically what that means is it's like, okay, you're politician X, and you're going to say we need to you know, we need to make all transportation free. And you're like, okay, well, great. That sounds good. But most people, when they sit down to it, it's like, okay, politician X, you want to make all transportation free. How does that work? How are you going to make that happen? And that question then is asking them to outline their theory of change. How are you going to make this thing happen? How are you going to make this change occur? Right. And this is actually a really important question, and it's connected in some ways to the language point, because if you look back to Barack Obama when he got elected on the message of hope and change, when you look back to the campaign, let's say of the campaigns of Bernie Sanders for president, when he had some very ambitious goals, the question always for politicians like that is, again, what's your theory of change? How are you going to make it happen? And some politicians have very robust theories of change, right? Like, so somebody like Elizabeth Warren, when she was running, the joke was she had a plan for everything. She was going to have a white paper that showed, like, from point A to point B, how she was going to do it. Other times people are more like, well, we'll, yada yada yada. So they just kind of hand wave it away. So I think, so one of the problems when we start talking about people like Moran and Marshall and getting in touch with them and sending them letters and asking them what they're doing and holding them to account is, it's like, what is the theory of change here? Right? What are we actually thinking that these things are going to do? And realistically, I think for most people, when you are contacting your legislator and you are sending them these things, when you're sending them an email or you're leaving them a voicemail or whatever, the amount that any one of those actions is going to actually change anything is, it's quite small. You are essentially, the theory of change you're subscribing to in that situation is kind of the idea of, it's all of the grains of sand, against kind of the gate to the castle, right? That it's just like you get this giant, sand dune after, eventually, and it tears it down or something. But the problem is that because we are all like individual people with, a certain amount of energy, and, we've got only so much that so much time to do this stuff, we want our actions to be big. We want our actions to have all of this impact. And yet I can tell you, even as someone who has kind of a public platform and who writes things that are read by, theoretically a bunch of people, I've had to come to terms with the fact that, like, the amount that any one of my columns might actually change things in the immediate time is not huge. However, there are a lot of other reasons to do things like this. So, I mean, this is the other point. So the theory of change does not necessarily mean that Marshall or Moran will ever do anything different. Perhaps the theory of change is that they understand that their constituents are unhappy, and that they might act somewhat different in the future. Perhaps the thing is that this builds support for a challenger to them in a primary, or perhaps for another party. Perhaps what it does is it actually builds bonds and connections between people who are trying to raise awareness about these issues, right? So, so the idea is that in a question like Paula has, you know, what is that changing? With that point about you and maybe your immediate circle. Well, maybe that change in your immediate circle, maybe that's actually where some of that value is. Maybe that's where the change is made. You know, so it's a very complicated question. I ended up feeling like a lot of times what it is making any kind of change is, it's this big kind of ocean liner, kind of going through the ocean, and making that ocean liner make a 90-degree turn or a 180-degree turn, that's really hard. But on the other hand, if you've had people who've been working for a really long time, and it's at 89 degrees, sometimes then those activists or whatever are able to push it like those remaining 3 or 4 degrees and make huge change. And so to me, I really look upon this, like, the example that I really think about on this is what conservatives managed to do during Donald Trump's first term with the Supreme Court. Conservatives have been working for 50 years to make the Supreme Court more conservative. And the thing was, it's easy to forget that if if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016, we would have a 6-3 liberal majority on the Supreme Court now, rather than a 6-3 conservative majority. So the thing is that, but conservatives, Federalist Society, Leonard Leo, all those people had spent a long time shifting that apparatus. And so when that window of opportunity opened, and they had the Senate in Donald Trump's first term, they were able, it just took a little bit. It just took a teensy amount of space at that point, and they were able to accomplish some really huge things. And again, it took a long time. It took a lot of activist groups, and it took luck. It took luck and chance for them to do that. And so I think anytime people who are kind of centrist or left of center look at change, you know, it can be a really long game, but things can also change really, really quickly when that window of opportunity opens up. Um, so yeah, sorry, that's a really long, it's a really long answer.
But a really good answer. And I think, speaking for myself, that's what's so frustrating about this current time. It took them 50 years to do that. And like you said, luck. But it is changing at warp speed right now. And that's why I think many of us feel, okay, we don't have 50 years. We have 6 months to get this changed. And I know that's not what this is about, but
Yes, please ask me about words.
well, what are some good resources? Like and I know I've gotten caught a couple of times in thinking that something was fact. And then somebody would say, well, I'm not sure about that. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it wasn't. Is Snoops, is that a reliable
No,
place to check?
Snopes, I
Or
believe it's called
Snopes, okay.
Snopes is fine. It's it's moved so that it's a fact-checking website or a kind of an urban legends site. It doesn't necessarily focus on politics as much. Sometimes it does a lot of memes and Facebook stuff. Snopes is fine. The old school fact checker sites like PolitiFact, tends to be pretty good. Most of the time with fact checkers too, by the way, don't pay attention to the ruling. Anytime you read a fact checker, never pay attention to like the mostly true, mostly false, how many Pinocchios, whatever. That is all, pardon it, it's BS really, because it's like if you read a movie review, right? And if you've ever seen the thing where you read a movie review and they give it like 4 stars, and then you read the review and you're like, it doesn't seem like it really was 4 stars or whatever. Oftentimes that grade is trying to take something that's you know a a story with several aspects to it and just reduce it to one thing. So really just wherever you find a fact check, read the fact check before you focus on the ruling. Um, is a little bit of advice. I think the other thing that's really important, and it's such a boring answer, and I apologize for how boring this answer is in advance, but please just read a couple of stories about the issue from different publications. So just like read something from the New York Times, then read something from the Wall Street Journal or the Post or even Fox News. And when I say that, I don't mean like Hannity Fox News. I mean the actual news operation at Fox, which is legitimate and includes employs real reporters. Um, because really I think a lot of times what happens, and I'm thinking really specifically of the big beautiful bill here, right? It was a bill that was hugely complicated. It had a lot of things going on. It changed very dramatically over time. And so the challenge was, we even ran into this. Like people were putting out press releases based on a previous version of the bill. People were putting out press releases based on like 2 versions of the bill ago. So really the best way you could keep track of what was in it was whatever that reporter in DC was putting out that day, right? And so, and again, it wouldn't be perfect, but I really encourage that. I mean, one of the things that I actually have told this to college students, so I will tell it all to you as well. I think a great way to deal with kind of um, spin and understanding how spin works is figuring out one issue to make yourself an informal expert in. And it might be something that you spent your career in or whatever, but make it like, I don't know, education, energy, economy, whatever. I remember when we had the Great Recession back in like '08 or whatever. I read a lot about the economy for a couple of years and got rather I mean, I've forgotten it all now. But the point is, find something where you can actually, just read a lot about it, have some interest in it, and then when you develop this independent knowledge base, maybe it's just about a disease, like just about a specific thing. I'm a type 1 diabetic, for instance, and I have been for like 35 years. So I can read articles about type 1 diabetes or like treatments for it, and I can tell really quickly if that person who's writing that has any idea what they're talking about. And let me tell you, a lot of times they don't. Um, so um, and I don't say that you should do this for every issue, but I think you should just have one. Just have a pet one. And then you can just track it when you just read other things in the news. Like, oh, well, how are they covering this? What are they saying about it? How are people talking about it? Because the truth is always more complicated and always more nuanced. And you'll also tend to find that when you do that, um, kind of regardless of what people think, that the news media is very seldom biased consistently one way or the other. So it's very seldom biased to the left or to the right. It tends to always be biased, I think, towards the most interesting story, the most drama in any situation, right? And I think that's actually a really important point when we talk about language. Is people love drama. We love conflict. We love exciting things. And so anytime that a politician or someone like that uses really dramatic words, really tries to get your emotional centers firing, it's always worth asking why that is. And it's always worth asking if it's true. I found it a little bit challenging here, especially when we dealt with some of the stuff out of California. And I think maybe we'll soon be seeing it in Chicago as well. When you have folks like Gavin Newsom or Pritzker, I think he is, who's the governor of Illinois, and they're saying very dramatic things about what's going on. And I'm not saying they're wrong, right? It's not that they're wrong, but they're also using this dramatic language for a domestic political purpose as well, right? As Trump is using his language for a national political purpose. So um it's again, it's not whether or not something is right or wrong. It is, what is the language being used for in that context, right? And everyone wants to use language to find an advantage, right? And of course, it also makes sense for someone like Newsom or Pritzker to use as dramatic language as possible because, they don't command the U.S. military, right? Rhetoric. If you're in a resistance or if you're in an opposition party, oftentimes dramatic language is your tool. Like that's the tool you have um, to face a government with more authoritarian inclinations. I'm bringing down the mood again. I'm sorry.
I've got a question, if I could. Next year, we'll be voting on an amendment that has to do with the selection, how our Supreme Court judges are elected. There will be two sides in this. One who will want constituents to vote no and the other to vote yes. There's going to be a vote of, there's going to be words, there's going to be slogans. It's going to be very interesting to see how those slogans or words are being chosen. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a really interesting one because I mean, frankly, the folks who are pushing the amendment have a really good rhetorical case to make in the sense of, well, you should be able to vote on it. Don't you want to be able to vote on it? And, I would expect, I mean, I don't know that they're going to have a much more complex case than that. The idea that this is an institution that makes important decisions in the state Supreme Court, and you, the voter, we trust you to make these important decisions. I think there is the realpolitik side of this, which is that if you have an elected Supreme Court in Kansas, it is almost certainly going to mean eventually that the state will ban abortion and the state will cut funding for schools. And so I think opponents of the amendment, and I have not spoken with them. I have not talked to them about this. This is just merely me as an outside observer. I would say that folks who are opposed to that amendment would be, probably would want to focus on the negative effects of this, of the fact that downstream of this, you would get all of these policy consequences that people in Kansas don't want. But it's going to be a really interesting campaign because I think I think to an extent when we had the Value Them Both campaign like 2 or 3 years ago, people kind of understood that they kind of were arguing in the same basic space, even though there was some talking past each other. Everyone kind of treated it as an amendment that was about abortion. I really think with the Supreme Court election amendment, the two sides are going to be probably talking about entirely different things. Like people might not even realize they're talking about the same amendment because it's to both sides' interests to like totally talk about different things. Marcy said, and any comments on the fact that the legislators who introduced the bill are also the ones that suggest the language printed on the ballot to explain the bill? Well, that's also a very important point. And one of the ones that, I guess in the end, they were blaming the failure of the Value Them Both amendment on the fact that they said, oh, it was too confusing. It's like, well, that's the language they wanted. That's the language they asked for.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a complex situation here in Kansas because we have a system where the state has been overwhelmingly Republican for so long that a lot of people are Republican and don't think about it. But they've also been shielded from some of the more negative parts of fallout of that because you've had a Supreme Court that has broadly speaking been fairly moderate. You've had a series of Democratic governors. And so even though the state is Republican, it's had fairly moderate governance. And so I think a lot of these folks in Kansas, at least Kansas voters, they like the moderate outcomes, but they also like that they don't have to vote for Democrats to get those things. And so I think there's a real dichotomy there, which is, is it gonna take a situation where people vote for a bunch of stuff and then have terrible consequences that they didn't want before they realize what that all, before they realize what they were really voting for.
That
Totally
kind
agree.
of
Go ahead.
happened during Brownback.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
and I think, and the challenge with Brownback was, and this is part of what I've written about in my book, when Brownback was governor, we still had a pretty functional, we had a pretty functional set of newspapers in the state.
Yeah.
The Harris Group was still operating, the papers in Hutch and Hayes and Salina. You still had the Capital Journal and some of its papers as a standalone, and really the voices of those papers across Kansas were very important in terms of spreading that news about what was happening with Brownback. I think the thing that concerns me now is that so much of that regional journalism has really been uh, just vaporized. And so, if we truly do get a Brownback 2.0 at some point in here, how will people know? How will that be communicated to them? And will they trust the people doing the communicating? And so who knows?
Can I ask, Clay, since you've just got a new book, if you can do a little plug for that?
Oh, well, I can tell you very small amount about it, but it's not going to be out until early 2027. So,
Oh, okay.
uh, but I will talk to you all about it then. But
Oh, okay.
it is a book that is talking specifically about folks who were opinion writers at Kansas newspapers from like the 1920s through the 1970s. So kind of starting with William Allen White and then going through a bunch of other folks. Angelo Scott, who was in Iola, Rolla Clymer, who was in El Dorado, the Boyds, Huck Boyd and all those folks up in northern Kansas. Peggy of the Flint Hills, who I'm sure some of you perhaps saw in the Capital Journal years ago. Anyway, about a dozen of those folks, but also just talking about why I actually think opinion writing is important. And there's just very little of that going on right now. People trying to, not even say like this is right or wrong, but just giving more context around the issues of the day.
I look forward to that.
Me
Me
too.
too.
I think we've
and-
got another question
Oh.
from Jane.
Yes. So Jane asks if we can say the correct vote against the amendment is for moderation to say electing judges is extreme and radical. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say one way or the other. I think that the folks who I think folks on either side will figure out what they want their messaging to be. I'd watch that. I mean, I'm very, very curious. I'm very, very curious to know what it is. Because again, the problem is if you say electing someone is extreme, then that gets into a real question of, do you trust do you trust the voters to make the right decision? And, no one wants to say we don't want to trust the voters. I think this is, I've always talked about this as I think broadly speaking, people like to vote for expansion of freedoms rather than restriction of freedoms, right? So this is why I've always thought that gun control is a particularly challenging message for folks who are kind of to the center and to the left, because if you think about it, something like same-sex marriage, for instance, expanding freedom, yay. Something like cannabis legalization, expanding freedom, yay. People like more options, people like more things. But then you have something like, gun control. It's like, narrow it down, close it off more. And again, it might be the right policy, but I think it's a harder sell to sell limits and to sell restrictions than it is to say, oh, we should keep opening everything up.
And that's why we're
Is
at,
it like-
that's why we're where we're at now. That decade of 63 to 73, those 10 years, when all the civil rights, the women's rights, environmental rights were expanded. And now this group that is trying to repress all those rights that were given has been working ever since then to go back. And they have to cheat to do it, and is how I look at it. they have to, or work the system, I guess would be a better way to
Well,
put it.
I think a lot of it has to do with the way in which there's been a multi-decade movement also to concentrate power in the executive branch
Yeah.
of government,
Yes, yes.
which is something also that both parties have done.
Mhm.
Both parties have been very willing to do, because legislating is very difficult.
Mhm. Yeah, it's hard work.
Legislating is very difficult, and so it's easier to say that Big Daddy in the White House is going to take care of everything for us, or give us direction. And and I think honestly that's part of the thing now, is when we talk about these words and why these words are important, like in many ways, that's the whole political process in our country now. It's much less about, are we passing this legislation or not? It's like, who is selling it? Who is
Mm.
talking about it in the most persuasive way? What are the words we're using? Like, the battle lines are all in terms of language. They're much less about legislative achievement and legislative compromise.
That's a great place to end.
Yeah.
Really, don't
This
you
has
think,
been good.
Susan? That is perfect.
This is
That-
good.
Yeah, that was
This
a
is good.
perfect summation.
We have recorded this, and so
Yes.
it will be available on our Facebook page very soon. And Clay, I'm a huge admirer of yours, as you know, because I'm always sending you notes saying bravo or something. And thank you for coming and talking about this war of words that we have going on, and helping
Mhm.
us kind of weave our way through it. This has been a very good discussion.
Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Clay. Till next time. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.